Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Rosa Murray, and I'm a member of the Scottish Laity Network. Tonight, it's my privilege to welcome you to the first evening of our Advent journey in 2022. The overall theme for our journey is Building the Future with Migrants and Refugees. This was the theme of Pope Francis's message for this year's World Day for Migrants and Refugees. But before we reflect on that message, let us recall Pope Francis's first pastoral visit outside Rome after his election in March 2013. On the 8th of July in 2013, he visited Lampedusa, and both the visit and his homily at the Mass were powerful statements about the focus of his papacy.
The altar itself was very symbolic. The base was a boat that was used by a group of North African migrants who fled their native land in hopes of a better future. During his homily, Pope Francis said one should not get accustomed to the suffering of others. He also denounced the so-called globalization of indifference.
Guardiamo il fratello mezzo morto sul ciglio della strada. Forse pensiamo, poverino, e continuiamo per la nostra strada. Non è compito nostro. E con questo ci tranquillizziamo, ci sentiamo a posto. Chi ha pianto per queste persone che erano sulla barca, per le giovani mamme che portavano i loro bambini, per questi uomini che desideravano qualcosa per sostenere le proprie famiglie? Siamo una società che ha dimenticato l'esperienza del piangere, del patire con la globalizzazione dell'indifferenza.
Throughout his papacy, Pope Francis has consistently urged us to reject the globalization of indifference and to seek to listen to the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. But it's more than just passively listening. It's a listening that requires our minds and hearts being open to the Spirit and our openness to being empowered by the Spirit to act. This is the dynamic of Pope Francis's message for this year's World Day for Migrants and Refugees, building the future with migrants and refugees.
Il contributo dei migranti e rifugiati è fondamentale per la crescita sociale e economica delle nostre società. È un potenziale che è pronto ad esprimersi, se solo gliene diamo una possibilità. Come possiamo, secondo voi, favorire lo sviluppo di questo potenziale?
How can we build the future with migrants and refugees? This is the question we seek to address during our Advent journey together. However, before we seek to address the question, let us, as is our tradition, spend a few minutes in prayer.
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Empty one, at the end of your resources, draw closer. Here in the now and the not yet of heaven's kingdom is all you need, more than you could imagine. You belong here. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Grieving one, God's arms are open wide, ready to draw you in with compassion and kindness. You are not alone in knowing loss and pain, and we stand with you. You belong here. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Quiet one, slow to speak and often overlooked. Please forgive us when we talk too loud and too long to hear you. Thank you for reminding us that sometimes the still small voice is the very one worth listening to. You belong here. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Warrior one, unflinching in the face of injustice, as you pour yourself out for others, may you know how God delights to strengthen you and how honoured we are to hold up your arms when they grow weary. You belong here. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Wounded one, gentle with others despite deep scars and hurts, you show us the way to follow Jesus. And when you feel your own need for mercy, may you know it in abundance. You belong here. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Honest one, too aware of the depths you hide from the world, remember that it's not by effort of will that you are made pure, but by lifting your face to meet Jesus and finding his eyes full of delight in and love for you. You belong here. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Fierce one, you who stand against chaos and conflict, when the time comes to be still, know that the Father calls you beloved child and invites you to find peace for yourself too. You belong here. And blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Beloved daughters and sons, facing all that is dark and heartless in this broken world, our hearts ache for you, and we honour your pain. We're sorry when we've turned our eyes away because it was too painful for us to look. May you know blessing, justice, and hope for the future. Beloved ones, in this season of Advent waiting, know that these blessings are yours, and may you know the comfort, the inheritance, the feasting, the mercy, the vision, and the belonging of the kingdom of God. Amen.
And now I hand over to Frank, who will welcome and introduce our companion for this evening.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure now to welcome and introduce our companion for this evening, Alistair Dutton, who is the Executive Director of SCIAF. A chartered engineer, Alistair studied physics at the University of Durham and philosophy, politics and economics at the University of Oxford. Alistair has worked in the international relief and development sector for 18 years, during which time he has led several major humanitarian responses and worked in over 30 countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. Alistair entered the sector when, as a Jesuit novice working for the Jesuit Refugee Service, he was seconded to Caritas Nepal. We are delighted to have Alistair with us again to help us understand the extreme suffering of the people of Tigray and how we can respond. Over to you, Alistair.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces, and for those of you who don't know me, it's great to meet you, albeit virtually. One second, I just want to share a photograph with you to get us started. So I hope you can see that. Yeah, there's a nod there, so from Rabs, so I'm going to take that as a yes. In January 2019, this is a picture of me with Bishop Joe Toll of Motherwell, who was president of SCIAF at the time. Excuse me. And Joe and I visited Tigray in the north of Ethiopia. And we're here standing on the border with Eritrea because at that time it was a time of real hope and optimism. With a new president in Ethiopia, and I'll talk more about Abiy, the president there, things had changed quite significantly from the previous president, Meles, who had been there, well, had fought for independence or fought against the Derg, and had then been president for many years. And things were finally starting to normalize after what must be 20 years with Eritrea, which is just to the north. So there was a real hope that the stalemate between Eritrea and Ethiopia would be overcome, and that things were looking up for both countries. And in fact, as a footnote, I've worked in Ethiopia now for off and on in various different ways. It's actually a bit longer since those notes were written. I think I've been working in Ethiopia for 20 years now. And in 2000, I helped Caritas Eritrea re-establish itself. I was part of a team that was with them for 6 months and then supported them from the UK as they re-established themselves. So there was a real sense that these two countries were moving on from the difficulties of those 20 years and the history that went before them. Unfortunately, November that year, so 2 years ago, almost to the day, no, sorry, a year later, sorry, a year, 18 months later, wasn't it? For reasons I'll describe in a minute, war broke out between the Tigrayan people in the north and the forces of the government. And if you excuse me a second, I'll show you a quick map so you have that in front of you. So Ethiopia is a country of about 110 million people. I imagine most of you know where it is and can put this in context, but you've got Eritrea to the north, if you can see my pointer, Sudan to the west, Djibouti and Somalia to the east, and then to the south you've got Kenya. And this region, which is shaded grey, is Tigray, and war broke out between Tigray and the government forces. It has been a barbarous and bloody war. There are estimates of some hundreds of thousands, anyway, of people dead, and brutal attacks which constitute crimes against humanity and are war crimes. And so that conflict broke out, as I say, November 2020. And one of the ways that the conflict has been fought by the government, at least, has been to isolate Tigray and to stop all supplies in and out of Tigray, including humanitarian supplies. Now, this is a bit clumsy, so excuse me, but I'll just want to find, hang on, before I share that. I just want to find another photo for you, which is Bishop Tesfaselassie, who I think it was a letter from Bishop Tesfaye, who's an old friend of mine in SCIAF's. Sorry, I've just lost my share button. So on the same trip, I hope you can see that, Joe Toll and I were with Tesfaye. And Tesfaye is the bishop for all of Tigray, really. He's based in a smaller city to the north of his diocese, which is called Adigrat. The main capital of Tigray is Mekelle. But as soon as war broke out, we had very disturbing reports from him for a short while, but very quickly communications with the region were almost completely severed. Occasionally, Tesfaye has managed to get a mobile phone up and running, and I've had a couple of snatched conversations with him, but the next time I've tried that mobile phone number, there's been no reply from it, and the line's clearly gone dark again. But Tesfaye has made a few very moving appeals for his people. He's absolutely clear that he would never leave Tigray, would never leave his people, and has been there beside them. But the conditions within the state of Tigray are dire. Obviously, we have no reliable humanitarian assessments because of the situation, and aid workers haven't been able to get in. Aid convoys have been cut off completely, and it's an entirely landlocked region, so there have been no supplies into the region. Many of the facilities, health facilities, education, schools, universities, have all been looted. So even what equipment was in the state has been plundered and taken away. The nutritional status of the population is at least category 4, which is desperate. It's the last one to famine, which is category 5. And with the damage that's been done to the farming over the last couple of years, it's difficult to believe that they produced much within the state. We have been unable to get any, not only have we been unable to get deliveries in, so supplies in, we've also been unable to get money in. And it's the amount that we have been able to get into the area in the last 2 years has been very scarce. The good news, and I'll probably talk a little bit more about it, and I'll try and answer questions on it, but it's early days. The good news is that in South Africa, 3 weeks ago, the Tigrayan leadership met with the Ethiopian government, and a peace agreement was signed with certain conditions, and it does seem as though aid convoys are starting to get in. So they are beginning to see some respite in their immediate humanitarian needs, or immediate respite for their immediate humanitarian needs. But it is very early days, and that peace accord is fragile and hinges on some quite uncertain developments. I'll talk a little bit more about those briefly. So how did we get from these pictures that you've seen of Joe and me up in Tigray, standing on the border of Eritrea, and a sense of optimism of putting some of the past and the internal conflict and the fighting with Eritrea behind it, to the situation today where we've had 2 years of war, thankfully a peace, but a fragile peace. But we've had 2 years of war and find a population in the dire straits that it has. As ever, as a student, someone read out, it was Frank read out that I'd done PPE at Oxford, and I did the international relations paper. And when trying to understand conflicts, it's very often helpful to look at who are the personalities at play, what was the cause that immediately precipitated the conflict, and what are the deeper underlying causes. In terms of the personalities at play, in recent times, the two leaders of Eritrea and Ethiopia are hugely significant. In the war against the Derg, because of course Eritrea used to be the northern part of Ethiopia. So you had Tigray and then you had Eritrea just to the north of it. And those two states allied very closely together and fought in the war against the Derg, which itself was a very bloody war. The Eritrean Tigrayan forces were better trained and more conservative in their use of personnel, whereas the Ethiopian government threw troops at it. And so the losses were much heavier on the Ethiopian side than they were on the Tigrayan and Eritrean side. But those two, Meles Zenawi for Tigray at the time, and Isaias Afwerki, who is the Eritrean president, those two were the joint commanders of the forces fighting against the Derg. There were all sorts of resentments between them, and they festered and were fed in the way that they interacted within the war, but they were united against a common enemy. And my novice master, well, actually the outgoing novice master said to me when I joined the Jesuits, and I said, "You must be pleased to be leaving." He said, "Yes, it was always difficult being unpopular enough that they were bickering about me and not between each other. And yet I had to be familiar enough that they'd open up to me." But I think that being unpopular enough to unite the novices he had under him, nothing unites a people more than having a common adversary. And so when they were fighting the Derg, Meles and Isaias made it work. But then in 1991, that conflict with the Derg ended. The Derg was overthrown, and Meles Zenawi became president of Ethiopia. I'm just going to go back to the map because I suspect that's a more helpful view. So Meles got the crown, if you like. He got Addis Ababa. And for 8 years, that kind of rubbed along, but there was still the resentments from between Isaias and the Eritreans and the Tigrayans and Meles. So between those two groups. And then in 1999, war broke out between Eritrea and Ethiopia, which was a battle for Eritrean independence. And that went on for about 18 months. And that was when I first went to Eritrea, was right at the end of that war, as peace was declared there. And so there was a deep resentment then between Isaias and Meles, and it really is between them as personalities. It's what I say about the importance of personalities. The people of the north of Ethiopia are almost the same as the Eritrean, and they have no particular axe to grind with the Eritrean people as a whole. It was much more about resentment in leadership than it was about peoples being at loggerheads. But the leaders are very powerful. They're almost, I think they both functioned at the dictator end of the political spectrum. And so after 2000, when the peace was declared between Eritrea and Ethiopia, there was a contested border that was never resolved. And so whilst there was a stalemate peace, there was a demilitarized zone between the two countries. And it was kind of it was an uncomfortable standoff. Meles continued to rule in Addis Ababa as the president, a very authoritarian, as I say, bordering on dictatorial reign. Many of his political opponents were imprisoned. Many members of the press were imprisoned. And that situation continued until his death. I mean, there are lots of other aspects to it, but that situation continued until his death. Meanwhile, in Eritrea, you had Isaias, who remained as president, even more controlling than Meles, quite a paranoid dictator. He never demobilized the forces at the end of that war in 1999-2000 for fear that there would then be insurrection and he would be removed. Because the power that both Meles and Isaias have in their respective constituencies was that they had beaten the Derg. But now that there was an Eritrean generation who had beaten Ethiopia, Isaias was frightened of losing his own power. And so he has never demobilized the army. He continually moves them around and splits up units and plays a whole game of shuffle several times a year, so that they never have the chance really to put their heads together and plot any kind of coup to remove him. And that was sitting to the north of Ethiopia. Then sorry, I've got to guess the year here. So Meles Zenawi died, so I'm going to have to guess this. I'm going to say about 2017, 18. And sorry, but one thing I have said it. What's very important is that Meles was Tigrayan and had been the president ever since they'd beaten the Derg. And most of the senior positions in the government and in the military and other top positions, private and public sector, were held by Tigrayans. So when Meles died, there was a huge amount of resentment elsewhere in the country that they'd never had a look in, and the power had really all been controlled by the Tigrayans. When Abiy was elected president of Ethiopia, in many ways it looked like a bit of a dawning of a golden age. And I think for those of us who are very concerned about human rights in different countries and regimes which are very unpleasant, well, as we've seen in other conflicts in the last 20 years, thinking about the transition and how to get from where we are to where we want to be needs an awful lot more thought than it is often given. And Abiy came in and there was immediately a lot more freedom of press. Many of the political prisoners and the journalists who had been imprisoned were released, and they returned to all their own different groups. And there are I've forgotten the number, but it's more than 40 ethnic groups in Ethiopia. And so they all returned to their own states. Many of the political leaders, although they'd never been through due process to incarcerate them, were not pleasant individuals, and having been incarcerated, were released as unpleasant individuals with axes to grind. And so they went back to their areas and in many cases started stirring ferment with a lot of sentiment that there should be revenge against the Tigrayans who had held control and who hadn't treated people entirely well throughout and had treated some people very badly. And so in that soup, with the opening up of Abiy's presidency, which kind of didn't create a vacuum of leadership, but it certainly led to things being much more open and free, and therefore for people to do more malevolent things as well as to do the things that freedoms might lead on to, which are more positive. And so it really got stirred up then, and then the conflict began. What it's important to remember, I think, is, so if I hope you can see this if I do it live, but has a drop-down list just appeared on your screen? Yeah. So that is a list of all the different conflicts, that are going on in Ethiopia at the moment. So I mentioned all those ethnic groups, and these different conflicts are happening in different parts of the country. And as I scroll down the list, down the map, each of those grey areas is one of those areas where one of the conflicts is taking place. So it puts us in, well, I think when you ask about what we do about it, it means that the situation is much, much more complicated than a desperate situation in Tigray, desperate as the situation in Tigray is. And I'm enormously concerned about Tigray and had hoped to be there 3 weeks ago, but it was not possible to get in. Not even a safety consideration. If I could have found a private plane that would get us in, I would have gone in, but it was not possible to get into the area. And I'm very concerned about Tesfaye, the bishop up there, but our partners in Mekelle and Adigrat, and the people that they're serving. But theirs is not the only conflict. And so as we think about how to talk about Ethiopia, how to respond to Ethiopia, what is the future for Ethiopia, we're really having to think about how do we bring together or hold together a country probably as a federation of multiple ethnicities and overcome the division, loss of trust, and animosity that is felt between the different groups. Sorry, I'm just pausing to wonder how much more detail to go in. I think perhaps some to say is that some of what we have seen is the Tigrayans, because they're landlocked, trying to fight out. If you can see my mouse moving, my cursor, trying to get out into Sudan there in order to supply themselves, in order to get food in, because that was being blocked by Addis Ababa. And in order to get armaments and supplies to keep fighting in. They were pushed back from that, and one of the most brutal, some of the most brutal incidences against the Tigrayans has been by the Amharans. So here on the here on the western side. Gondar is the old capital of Ethiopia. And so the Amharians, and the language they speak is Amharic. So that is the old, if you like, ruling clan. But they have prevented the Tigrayans getting a corridor out into South Sudan. So when we come to the peace agreement that was negotiated 3 weeks ago, I think many commentators were quite surprised that the Tigrayans signed on the terms they did. And I was quite surprised. I'm one of them. So they've signed a peace accord, which is good. It opens humanitarian access, which, by the way, is protected under the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law, but was not being respected. So it opens up humanitarian access, but it has, perhaps you'd say, of course, and there's part of me says, of course, but it means that Tigray has now accepted, the Tigrayan leadership has accepted that Tigray will now fall back under the auspices of the national government. So it remains part of Ethiopia, and the Tigrayan forces are now going to disarm. And they have, under the terms of that ceasefire, they have 30 days to disarm. The difficulty is, and part of the reason I spoke so much about the Eritreans earlier in describing the hostility between them and the Tigrayan people, is once Abiy came into power and immediately opened up that relationship with Eritrea. So just after I'd been with Joe Toll in the north of Ethiopia, you couldn't cross the border by land, but I flew into Asmara, and there was a moment where you could go into Eritrea. It was hard to get visas, it always is, but I managed to get in and visit the church and visit Caritas there at the same time. But the resentment between the Eritreans and the Tigrayans really, maybe that was the cause, but it must have helped bring or push the Eritreans, so Isaias, the president in particular, into the arms of Abiy, the new president of Addis Ababa. And it's always been denied by the Ethiopians, but it is clear that Eritrean forces have been fighting in Tigray and have been some of the most brutal. There have been massacres, rape used as a weapon of war, civilians summarily killed in refugee camps disappeared, and the Eritrean forces have been very significant in that. And needless to say, the Tigrayans are going to be very slow to lay down their arms if the Tigrayans are going to be slow to lay down their arms if the Eritreans are still in the area and are armed and are likely to perpetrate any of the things they have been doing over the last 2 years. So as we stand today, we have that peace agreement in place. The peace, as far as we know, is holding. In fact, it is holding. Humanitarian aid is now beginning to get in. It will be slow to, we now need to build up the supply chain to get it in, to get the logistics going. But that is starting to roll in. But there are some technicalities to the peace accord that have to be satisfied. There are some agreements within the peace accord that have to be upheld if that is to continue. And just finally to finish, I can't do it while I'm sharing my screen. I'm going to stop sharing my screen a moment. Sorry. I was in touch with our head of office in Addis Ababa, and today I was in touch with him. And for those who don't know, we SCIAF have a completely joint program with CAFOD for England and Wales and TROCRA for all of Ireland. You know the accidents of history that mean that CAFOD covers the Bishops' Conference for England and Wales, SCIAF covers Scotland, and TROCRA covers the Bishops' Conference for all of the island of Ireland. But in Ethiopia, we have a completely joint programme. So we jointly form the governance of that, and then we have an office. It's the only place where SCIAF has an office, but we have an office in Addis Ababa. And I visited the staff there as I passed through Addis Ababa 3 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago now. That's the first time I've managed to get in since the beginning of 2019. It was great to see them. One of the staff, who is a fabulous woman, our head of programs, who is Tigrayan, had just been up into Mekelle, which is the capital of Tigray. So this would be 2 months ago now, when there had been a ceasefire, and she'd gone up with 2 members of staff to set up and get going some relief programs that had become possible. The day she arrived in Mekelle, the war broke out again. And she and the other 2 members of staff were stranded in Tigray, in Mekelle, unable to get out for 6 weeks. And there was no overland transport, no flights. I suspect, and I've just gone blank on her name, I know her so well. Anyway, it'll come to me. But I suspect she, for her being stuck in Mekelle, was a bit of a blessing, because she has been very close to the Tigrayan leadership historically, and so being back with her people at a time of war would be quite good. But it was uncomfortable having 3 members of staff up there, and in terms of keeping them safe. But it also meant that we couldn't get the programme going as we'd intended to. In the message I just had, the exchange I had with Rob, who's our country representative there at the moment, he said, yes, the peace agreement does seem to be being implemented, although quite slowly. Humanitarian access is starting to reopen again. So they're remaining cautiously cautiously optimistic are his words. But he says that the main factors will determine whether the peace holds is the departure of the Eritreans and militia forces from Tigray, which will be a precondition for the disarmament that's required as well. The other bits of good news are that we have at last managed to get money to our partners up in Tigray in the last 2 weeks. So actually, it was last Friday for the first time we managed to send some money up on a UN flight that was going up, and again today. So just today we managed to get the second amount of money. There's no banking services up there, so we're literally sending bags of cash, which get handed over to our partners at the other end. With sufficient checks and balances, you can all be reassured so that none goes missing. But yes, we're having to use very informal routes to get in. Rob is travelling into Mekelle. He's flying up to Mekelle next Thursday. And he will, or is hoping, to go up to Adigrat. So he will see Bishop Tesfaye, and he'll be with the partners in Mekelle, which is the main base, but he'll also be with the partners in Adigrat. And that'll be, that'll be the first time really we have first-hand news of how they are. When Tamrat is her name, there you are, it's come back to me. When Tamrat was stuck in Mekelle during that last fighting, they could have no contact with Adigrat either. So it's not even that they can communicate within Tigray. They've all been very, very isolated. So yes, to leave on a positive note, there is a peace agreement which is moving along, but it's, as all these peace agreements always are, it is tentative. There has to be a peace dividend for all parties in order for the peace to hold. And an awful lot of trust needs to be rebuilt. And sorry, just one last thing. I said I'd finish, but the other thing, when I was there, and there's a photo I won't show you, but I was with the Cardinal of Addis Ababa, the Cardinal Archbishop of Addis Ababa, together with the Secretary General of the Bishops' Conference and the Director of Caritas Ethiopia, and was talking to the Cardinal about what role the Church could play in fostering peace within the country and how we could help from outside. The Cardinal's response was that, honestly, as it stands today, the division within the Church is very, very painful. The Tigrayans in the Church feel abandoned by the rest of the country. The rest of the country, that dialogue has broken down. I'm not sure I even want to try and characterize it quickly. And so I'm currently working with Caritas Ethiopia and Justice and Peace in Ethiopia to try and put together a peace and reconciliation mission to try and bring the different sides of the Church together and reinitiate that dialogue. The good news is that they are, unlike some of the other religions, believe there must only be one church. So there's no talk of separation within the Catholic Church. That's not the case with the Protestant churches or with the Muslims, and they're talking about having a separate Orthodox church for Tigray, I heard, and the Muslims in Tigray have kind of severed links with those elsewhere in the country. So I think, once again, that real small c Catholicism of the Catholic Church puts us in a position to be a bridge builder across the divide of that conflict. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Frank, and if I've spoken too long, apologies.
Alistair, you've given us so much to consider, and I'm going to jump straight into the questions because you've given us so much to consider that the questions have been coming thick and fast while you have shared with us. But please, folks, do continue to share more. And I'm just going to go straight in with one for a kind of an appeal for a little bit more background around the causes of the conflict and the kind of support, or has the population, kind of local population, supported the, where has the fuel come that's kept it going?
So the Tigrayans have really held all of the positions of power for so long in the military and in government that far and away the most competent administration in Ethiopia today is in Tigray, and the most competent military is in Tigray as well. And so whilst they didn't necessarily have at the outset the supplies and armaments to win this war, repeatedly they have captured large quantities of the Ethiopian army's resources and moved them into their area and have used them to fight. So actually, the Ethiopians have ended up giving a lot of the means by which the Tigrayans have defended themselves. I think that was starting, there's a suspicion, I won't even go so far as to say I think. I suspect that one of the reasons that they signed the peace agreement that they did, I think the two main reasons were, on the one hand, that the humanitarian conditions within the state are now so dire that they don't want to suffer anymore. And they also no longer had sufficient resources to maintain the fighting. But I think they've just captured a lot of what they've been using to fight it. There's unusually, so Marion, I saw your story, your question about Sudan. Unusually, there's not particularly a mineral wealth or a resource that they're fighting over. It's not like the Congo, for example, where they're clearly fighting over mineral resources. Sudan, so the Tigrayans were quite close to Sudan. Ethiopia had, under Meles, so under the Tigrayan president, Ethiopia had quite a good relationship with Sudan, and Sudan offered some early supply routes when they did manage to open up to the west. The whole issue of the Nile and the water of the Nile, and we Brits have so much to be mindful of when we think of the deal that was done with Egypt over the waters of the Nile and the Aswan Dam. But if anything gets done on the Nile anywhere, I was just in South Sudan for 2 months, 2 months, that would be nice, wouldn't it? For 2 weeks. And there's all sorts of things that should be done on that side of the Nile. There's 2 branches of the Nile. But you can't touch the Nile without Egypt kicking up a shindig. And so pragmatically, Sudan needed to be closer to the Ethiopian government to jointly balance the Egyptians in terms of the waters of the Nile, which I think meant that the strength of the relationship with Sudan became weaker. There were Tigrayan refugees, so we have a response, part of our response, and CAFOD has taken the lead on this for us. On the Sudanese side of the border was Tigrayan refugees who managed to get across earlier. But then the Amharans got their act together and really cut that access route off. I mean, as we know, I mean, in terms of refugees, many of the refugees who get to our shores have been Eritreans for some time. I'm not aware that the Tigrayans have actually managed to get to the UK in many numbers. I'll leave it there for Colin. I'm sure for now, Colin, I'm sure there's loads more, but yeah.
It is, it's fascinating, but obviously an incredibly complex kind of picture to try and get us, become familiar with, I suppose. I want to jump to something slightly different because, I can imagine it's an unenviable task as, SCIAF as a whole, but particularly in your own role, to look at everywhere that requires your help, your support, and discern where to target it. So how does SCIAF discern what countries and projects to support in conflict situations? Is there a risk of being seen to take sides? How do you consider all of this, Alistair?
Sure. Well, I'll answer the taking sides bit after. I'll answer a general question about choosing countries and then how we avoid taking sides secondly. When I joined SCIAF, I think we worked in 24 countries with our long-term development work. The first strategy that we worked on together after I joined, so that we wrote that in 2015. We reduced that to 14 countries, and we're actually just reducing to 8 countries. We've nearly finished exiting from the other countries where we have been working. And we've done that not because the money's drying up. In fact, our income has held quite well, thanks to the generosity of many of you on the line tonight. But we've done it because a real desire to go deeper, not further, and to know the context where we're working better, to be able to have this depth of understanding that means I can talk to you tonight, and so that we can know better what is most appropriate and what will make the greatest impact. But we can also look for economies of scale, but also greater synergies. So if we have one partner in 24 countries, in each of 24 countries, each project we do runs in isolation. And it's quite difficult to know what the impact of that is at any scale. If we concentrate and have 5 or 6 partners in one country, then they can start working together and feeding off one another's strengths and helping one another with the gaps they have. And we can work much more nationally within that country. So then we can start to think about a model of change which starts with communities and them identifying what the problems are. They can work locally on the issues that they can tackle themselves, but we can help them raise the issues with local and national government so they can tackle some of the policy issues that need to change in order for them to make a difference. So that's why we're reducing the number of countries. And that immediately throws up the question, which you've asked, so how do you work out which countries? And it's painful, right? When you've worked in these countries for 20 odd years plus, we've got very strong relationships and personal friendships with many people. And we've had to have conversations where we've said, look, we just have to make this decision. And so what we did was we set out some criteria that we would use. They start with the level of poverty in the country, with all sorts of different ways of looking at poverty, exclusion and injustice in countries. We look at who else is working in the country. We look at our history in the country and the partnerships we have there. And so what we've really been trying to do is to work out who are the most forgotten in the poorest and most marginal places where we can make a substantial impact. And they're the ones that we've chosen to remain with and to concentrate on. So that's how we choose the countries. And so now we work in 8 in terms of our long-term development programs. 6 of those are in Africa, simply because that's where the poorest countries are. So I mentioned I'm just back from South Sudan. That is number 191 out of 191 of the poorest countries. I mean, it's the poorest country on earth. It's the youngest country on earth. In 2011, it became independent, and since 2013 has been in civil war. So we work in South Sudan, Ethiopia, Rwanda, the Congo, Malawi, Zambia, and then we wanted to maintain a global footprint rather than just an Africa footprint. So we did think about the geography more widely. In Asia, we continue to work in Cambodia, and in Latin America, we continue to work in Colombia. So those are the 8 countries we've chosen. We then respond to emergencies wherever they are. And so last year we responded to 24 emergencies in 16 countries, I think. Now for those, it just depends where the emergency happens. So if it's a massive emergency, then very often we'll have an emergency appeal, and many of you respond very generously to those, as we did as you did for the Ukraine this year. So we now have a response in the Ukraine with Caritas Ukraine, and that's how we work in emergencies. Just finally on how do you avoid taking sides? There are 4 absolutely fundamental principles to humanitarian action. The first one is the dignity of the individual and the right to receive humanitarian aid. The second one is neutrality, that we must never take sides in conflict. The third is impartiality. Oh, I've forgotten what the fourth one is. It'll come to me. Anyway, with neutrality, it's a question of trust. We have to negotiate access, and when we go in, so we have to negotiate with both sides in order to be able to get in. And when we're in areas, they have to know that we aren't partisan in any way to the conflict, that is. And so we go to great lengths to look at not only our sense of how neutral and impartial we are, but also the perception of that from the communities and militia, etc., we're having to work with and around. Yeah.
I think that's really helpful and gives us a real sense of the kind of complexities involved, but also where SCIAF is moving. There's an interesting question that's been raised, and again, kind of returning to the specific example around Tigray that you mentioned tonight. How much has the history, or how much do you think the history of colonial interference in the region has contributed to these continuing hostilities?
Sorry, can you ask the question again? Sorry, I was reading.
Yeah, it's an interesting one in the chat. It's asking us, how much do you think the history of kind of colonial interference has impacted on or contributed to these continuing hostilities?
Unusually for Africa, very little. And the reason I say that and say it so quickly and with conviction is Ethiopia very proudly says it was never colonialized. It was invaded by the Italians, who held it for a period of 5 years during the war, and the British Allied forces, British forces primarily, beat the Italians. I've got that date somewhere, sorry. So yes, yeah, in January 41, we led the Allied liberation and drove the Italians out. And at that point, the previous emperor, Haile Selassie, who incredibly became emperor in 1930 and was deposed in 1974. So he had 44 years on the throne with a brief interregnum when the Italians took it from him. But so it was never colonialized in the same way, Callum.
I think it's helpful to have that sense of the history. Now, again, just invite everybody to continue to share questions and to kind of reflect on what you're saying. Thoughts as well, kind of comments would be really helpful. You mentioned a great deal about the peace agreement that had been reached. But I wondered if you might talk a bit more about that. And in particular, one questioner asks, is there within the peace agreement scope for Tigray having autonomy? How does the land of each area compare? Is one area richer? So I wondered if you could talk us through some of the kind of finer details of the peace agreement.
No, not really. I mean, yes, a bit, but I mean, so the Tigrayans did not want to come under Addis Ababa. And a fundamental term of that peace agreement is that they now come back under the governance of the Ethiopian government. And that was a fundamental term of the peace agreement. So I don't think there is any sense that that Tigray would be autonomous. I think if you look at the level of unrest in the country, if you look at the different ethnicities, and in a way, I mean, this is where it's really hard in Africa or in some countries. You know, Meles ruled with an iron fist, and there wasn't much of velvet glove on that. It was an iron fist for a long time. It was repressive. There wasn't freedom of press. People were incarcerated without due process, and there were political prisoners. The country was doing okay, though, people were it was relatively peaceful. There were a couple of pockets of war, of fighting, but that was out on the Sudanese border and did bleed across from Sudan a bit, I think. So the human rights position under Meles was not favourable, but he held the country together and it functioned, and economic growth was quite good. So people's daily lives improved quite substantially under Meles, but you have to hold your nose to the human rights implications. You've got the same in Rwanda. I mean, Rwanda is arguably one of the success stories in Africa at the moment, but Kagame, the president there, rules brutally. And the deal that people, the government seem to have struck with people in countries which beneath the surface perhaps aren't so stable is that into some of their freedom rule for an economic prosperity. And that just seems very hard for us to accept. But that seems to be the deal they cut with themselves. Abiy came to power through a free and fair election, opened everything up, but he's opened up a Pandora's box. The consequences of that might lead to a more federal structure for Ethiopia. It could become very federal. That's the other thing, because there's so many ethnicities, once you go federal, what's the unit of federation, and how would that play out? My sense is once things start to divide, the friction grows, it doesn't diminish. So I think the intention is to try to hold it together in a more unitary sense.
And I think that, again, that kind of gives us a realistic sense from you of hope, but underpinned by, I suppose, a sense of realism as well. The next question I want to take probably looks at the media outlook on the situation, the effect or the impact that that has. And it asks us, do you think that the lack of reporting of the extent of human suffering in the area by the media here is deliberate, so that people fleeing the area will not be seen as refugees from war? So, around perception, particularly the disparity between perception of refugees, the questioner points out, from Ukraine and from African countries, but more easily labelling them economic migrants, which kind of suits the political agenda. Do you think that has an impact? And would you agree with that kind of analysis of the situation?
No, I don't think so really in this instance. I'm quite a critic of the British media and its unwillingness to talk about refugee flows in ways which do justice to the people and the lives they're both fleeing from and trying to build for themselves. But I think in Ethiopia, or around the conflict in Tigray, I think some of it is bandwidth. Ironically, I think with the birth of 24-hour media, we've hollowed out our media, so we don't have the level of staffing in broadcast or print. Mariam might comment on this, but in broadcast or print, for people to be able to do the level of journalism that they did previously when decent papers had quite a number of journalists on staff. So I don't think the media has the ability to cover in quite the depth that we would have seen in the past. I also think in terms of bandwidth, another consequence of the 24-hour media, it seems to me, is actually we get less news, not more, and it's just a revolving news packages that you see many, many times, but you don't get the quality of reporting. And so it gets captured by the big stories of the day. And if you look at the last, well, since 2016, it's just been psychodrama after psychodrama, and the British can't get out of their own heads, if you ask me. I mean, we had all of the Brexit thing and all the way through the referendum, but then what was happening with Brexit, then we went into COVID. I don't know how many of you need to see the inside of another hospital. I know I don't. I know the story about how bad it was in hospitals, but we seem to have got captured on, become captured by one or two stories at any one time, rather than having decent international journalism anymore. And I'm not sure whether there's, how much of that is within media or how much actually is driven by audience and what audiences are interested in. And the two probably interact to a degree. And the third thing I'd say is, and sorry, there's a comment popped up from Marion. You're right, Marion. I'm talking from a very UK media perspective. If you look at things like Al Jazeera, you will get a lot more coverage. I also follow a whole load of other news wires, which are much more humanitarian related. So I get a lot of it that way. But sorry, the other thing I was going to say in terms of how little coverage there's been of this, nobody could get in. So there was no story to tell. Occasionally, the BBC have managed to get a Kenyan reporter in, because I think that's their near, or maybe it was someone. I think that maybe the reporter was based in Addis, but only very occasionally have they managed to get any reporting in. The Guardian has quite faithfully tried to do stories, but the frequency of them has been low, and they've been one-offs when they've been able to do it.
I know that you mentioned a few kind of more positive news outlets there. We've got a question here. Would you consider recommending some of them? I know we've talked about Al Jazeera, but are there others specifically that you think are worth keeping an eye out on?
Gosh, yes. Trouble is, I get them on an automatic email now. So, well, this crowd I shared at the outlet. What's this called? Hang on. The Ethiopia Peace Observatory. They have their EPO. I can here. Let me. I hope this works. That's the Ethiopia Peace Observatory. I think it's EPA is another newswire I've used. There's also what's the IRIN? IRIN is a news service provided by UN OCHA. And if you Google UN OCHA, you'll find lots of humanitarian dashboards there. But I mean, for a lot of the time, we have just been following Twitter accounts of people we know, and it's been very bitty, the information we've managed to get out.
That's really helpful. Thank you for the links as well. I think that's really helpful. And for those that don't get a chance to pick up those in the chat, I know that Rab will send them out in the subsequent email from tonight as well. But that's really, really helpful. Is there one thing, Al, that you would like SCIAF to be able to do, you know, specifically in Tigray, but which you can't due to the current situation? I know you spoke about your own difficulties in terms of being able to visit, but is there any one thing that you would like to be able to do, but you can't because of the current situation?
Well, hopefully it's about to change. Get there, get the programs up and running again. I mean, if we're able to go to scale up in Tigray, we can make an enormous difference. We've got the partners there. SCIAF Trokra has a great set of partners up there, and the church up there has real capacity to make an immediate and enormous difference to people who are in the situation they are. To do that, we've first got to get in, and hopefully that's shifting now, and I hope Rob gets in next week. That should go ahead, I hope. And then there's the question of how we pay for that. And so, yeah, all three of us have been trying to raise money to pay for that. But get in and get the programs up and running. I mean, I think that is the thing. And within the context of Ethiopia, we say very, very little politically. And if we do, we'll be shut down. So you won't see us making big statements on Ethiopia. We would be driven out the country if we did so. We do have, conversations behind the scenes with diplomats of the different governments, and trying to bring diplomatic pressure, but that hasn't carried much weight. But we have, first and foremost, to do whatever we can in terms of humanitarian relief, and access and funding will be the big issues for that in the next months, assuming the peace agreement holds.
And then kind of looking again at the conflict, just almost trying to tie it all back together and looking again at the conflict, what do you say are the issues or the factors that perpetuate it? And in particular, the questioner was asking about where kind of weapons supply comes from, for example. Is there international issue there? But kind of overarching, what is perpetuating the conflict, do you think, in that sense?
Hatred, revenge. Some of it is personalities. Isaias needs to die, honestly. He needs to no longer be the president of Eritrea, because for as long as he is here, he will be a belligerent force from the north. And that's for the good of Eritrea as well. I'm not advocating anyone line up an assassination, you understand. But, you know, for a long time I've said Isaias and Meles had to go. He won't step back. There is no way Isaias will step back. Meles wouldn't either. They're both old men and they're locked in an old history. So personalities are key. There are strategic relationships, both sides, who are arming them. In fact, the Western diplomatic community has been more closely allied with Tigray, which is understandable. I'm not sure. I mean, I suspect a lot of that has to do with the historical relationship that they all had with the Ethiopian government when it was all Tigrayan. So the people they know are at that level. It's also, the Tigrayans have been subject to, we have to remember this, the most horrific human rights abuses. What has been perpetrated by Ethiopian troops and Ethiopian troops, Eritrean troops, the Afar, Oromo, and the Amhara and militias has been absolutely brutal. So more of the arms for Tigray have come from Western governments. The Gulf states are more closely allied with Abiy, and so I think quite a lot of armaments of funding has come from Gulf states. Russia in this one is closer to Abiy, and no, to Eritrea, which is why Eritrea was one of the 4 states who didn't vote against Russia when Russia invaded Ukraine. So there's all of those alliances. I mean, I've tried to keep it in the country. If you bring in all the international alliances as well, the map gets very complicated indeed.
And then finally, perhaps I could take the 2 final questions together. The first one would be around the dialogue that you have on these issues with Scottish, UK government and other agencies. And the final question would be, you spoke about some of the projects you'd like to get back up and running. Perhaps you could give us a couple of examples.
Yeah, sure. How long do you lot want to stay on the line for?
We'll offer an additional session afterwards.
Sorry, first one, dialogue with government. So, as you all know, foreign policy, diplomatic relations are reserved powers. So we deal with the UK government for those. And we have been talking with them more often than not. It's CAFOD who go and meet with them simply because they're in London and can walk across the road more easily. So lots of talking with the UK government about what diplomatic channels can be used, but also diplomatic channels to open up humanitarian access, etc. With the Scottish government, it's more, they have a humanitarian emergency fund, which has limited resources, quite limited resources, but we have managed to get funding from them for our response. So it's been more on the funding side for humanitarian response rather than the diplomatic side with the Scottish government. The Irish are very seen as very pro-Tigrayan, to the point that there's even a question of whether the embassy will be reduced to essential staff only. I don't think there's a suggestion that it close the embassy, but that it's becoming more and more difficult for Irish staff to remain in country because of the stance the Irish government has taken. And you want to see projects?
Perhaps even just one or two examples of the types of project that you're talking about would be helpful.
Let me see how easily I can show you a few pictures. So let me.
I think that's helpful, Al, because it's great to hear about the examples of the types of work that you're doing. So,
okay, the easiest way to do this, I did a presentation from a parish the other week. Sorry, let me just find that presentation and flick it open. Otherwise, I've got to pick out photos from my all my photos, and that may not be. I'm not sure that will share very easily. Where did I do this? That was it. So excuse me a second, I'm just opening the file, or I hope I'm opening the file. It's never quick when you want it to be. It assures me it's thinking about it.
Technology is a great thing when it works.
Grand. Here we go. I'm coming in. Let me find somewhere to start. So, what have I got here? Yeah, let's show you this. It's a wonderful thing when it works, isn't it? If only I could make it work. Let me have a go. Now,
got you.
So you got a picture there. I could try and go into slideshow mode, but I suspect it will do funny things. So let's just keep it as it is for ease. So out in this is all in Tigray, actually. No, it's not. There's another example. Two projects here. I might show you some other pictures. This is just outside Mekelle in Tigray. And the picture on the left, so to get to this project site, you drive down a road. If you look over the right-hand side of the road, you look into the valley, which is on your left, as you look at it. And that's a valley we haven't worked in. And you can see very, very stony, just scrubbing it, doesn't retain the water, there's no soil fertility, very little grows, and nobody bothers to farm it. The picture on the right-hand side looked like the left one 5 years ago. And does that enlarge when I zoom in? Yeah, okay. You can see now it is terraced all the way. And well, let me go through the next slides and we'll start to see what's happening. So actually, so I'm flicking two together to show different things. So this is a leap up into Eritrea and a project that we're running together with CAFOD up there. And they started off in a rocky valley, like you see on the left. Actually, what those guys are doing at the moment is building a dam across this ravine. And when the dam fills in, when the dam is built, all the sediment gets washed down by the torrential rain during the rainy season, gets caught by the dam, and you end up with a very flat stretch of land like you see in the right-hand one. Now, when you're further down the gully, that's still quite steep and you don't get very much width at all. The picture on the right, it's starting to open up, but when you get to the top of that valley, you end up with a plateau now of very fertile sediment, which also acts as an underground reservoir. So a few pictures of what we've been doing. The first valley you saw, where I showed you all those crops on the right-hand side, the top left-hand corner there is the top of the valley we were looking down into initially. And what we've done is with the farmers, they've done all of this terracing and planting. This is terraced as well, where these trees are. Terracing, planting plants to shore up the edges of the terracing, and then planting trees. The trees, it's amazing actually, they create their own little microclimate. So it is much damper under trees than it is not under trees. We kind of know that from our own back gardens, but it works really effectively even in the driest places. But by doing all of this terracing right at the top of the valley, it slows down all of the rainfall when it comes. It traps the sediment so that the fertile soil isn't washed away. And when the water is slowed down, it sinks into the ground and you slowly replenish the aquifers. And then there's some examples here of the check dams that we build going up those ravines I was talking about, and we string those together. So we will build something, I think we had something like 25, 26 of these check dams going all the way up, so that when you get to the top of that valley and the plateau opens out, you have a large area of farmable land. And in each of these check dams is trapped water. And so here's some pictures that show you what this filled in land starts to look like. That would have been a rocky valley before. And you can see from this right-hand one, actually, you've got the top of the check dam here, and extending behind it now, you have a lot of flat land. That land wasn't there before the project. That's filled in as a result of building these check dams. So you build the check dams, you slow the water down, you trap the sediment, you generate fertile ground, the water percolates into the ground. Very quickly, you start to see, what have I got here? Okay, I'm jumping around a bit. So then you start to see water becomes available for the first time ever. So I know this looks like a tiny, dirty, muddy hole to us who are used to gallons of water pouring out of taps, but that is the first time there's been standing water for over 30 years in that valley. And so now you will see this area where the guy is standing, and well, the two at the bottom there, they've left those more open like that, and so they can water their cattle there. And the top ones, and they look disgusting, but that is now where the villagers come and take water, where previously there was no water. Now, what you can do, and what we need to do as we go on with this project, is if through the dam, sorry, if I go back to the dam, if through the dam wall here, you just bring a pipe out on the downhill side and put a tap on it, the sediment and sand that's trapped in that dam acts as a filter and you get clean water, drinking water. And that's potable drinking water by the time it's been filtered like that. So there's extra additions we need to build onto these things.
This is incredible, Al. This is incredible to hear and fantastic to hear about your projects. I'm sure it's something that we could go on about for hours. And perhaps could even be the topic of another session. But thank you very, very much.
Just let me leave you with two things, Callum. The first is visual, and this is now, so this is the top of that valley we were talking about. And not only are they farming, they've got running water, but this now looks bucolic. This looks like farming on the Black Isle as it would have been when they did it with ox ploughs, right? But just as you think about it, it occurred to me, sorry, I'm leaping topic completely because I know you need to close, but thinking about refugees and what we do with refugees, we had safeguarding training in SCIAF yesterday and Stella Maris joined us for it, so the apostleship of the sea. There are two floating cruise ships moored, one just outside Glasgow and one just off Leith, I think. Yeah. They've got about 1,500 refugees, Ukrainian, I think it's 1,500 on each, Ukrainian refugees. And I just wondered if you're looking for something to do very practically, something we're doing, I'm down in Oxford at the moment, I got down from Glasgow today, but we're doing Christmas presents for refugees, and I just wonder whether there's something practical about Christmas boxes or presents for refugees who are stuck on refugee boats and can't even come ashore.
That sounds like a fantastic idea to leave us with, and thank you very much once again, Al, for sharing with us, and indeed for spending some time talking more practically about the projects that you are involved with. I do indeed wish we had more time to look at that, and hopefully we will going forward. But now I'm going to hand over to Rosa.
And I'm going to hand over to Frank for some words of thanks.
I'm just waiting for a PowerPoint presentation, or do I just read the prayer, Rob?
Yeah.
So, a prayer for Alistair. Loving God, we thank you for the insight and compassion of Alistair. We thank you for his sharing of the signs of the times in our broken and divided world. We ask that you anoint him anew, such that his ministry may continue to be empowered by your Spirit. Amen. We'll also pray for SCIAF. Loving God, we thank you for the witness and loving action of SCIAF, We affirm and commit ourselves to their vision of a just world, free of poverty, where we flourish and live in harmony with each other and all creation. Empower them with your spirit. Amen.
So we now close with our Advent prayer, which Carmen is going to read. Thanks, Carmen.
Come, Lord, your wounded world is yearning for you to come again. Come, Lord, your weary world is crying out for you to lift us up out of our despair, our hunger, our thirst for something better, our need for the food that will last. Come, Lord, come again. We need to begin again.
Thank you, Carmen, and thank you, Alistair, and thanks for everyone who's been with us tonight and joined us in our first week of Advent. We look forward, hopefully, to being with you next Thursday for the second evening of our Advent journey with our companion Fiona Kendall, who is a mission co-worker with Mediterranean Hope. It'll be an opportunity to hear stories of migrants and refugees and those who have sought to welcome and integrate them into their country and all the challenges in doing this. We look forward to seeing you all then, and I know from speaking with Fiona already, there's a lot of interesting and challenging stuff that she has to tell us about her work and about the current situation. To those who are leaving the meeting at this point, good night, God bless, and we invite you to log off. And for those who wish to stay on and join a breakout room, please stay connected, and in a few minutes we'll generate the breakout rooms. Thank you everyone, good night.